So you're thinking about buying a home at the Oregon coast and trying to decide where you should be looking. Well, in this video, we're going to talk about how to approach the process, what areas you should be focusing on, and all that starts now. Hey, what's up everybody? This is Clem with the Home Team Brokers coming to you from the Oregon coast. And if this is your first time to the channel living on the Oregon coast and you want to get more videos like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button and tap that little bell to get notified every time we drop a new video. We've helped so many people relocate to the Oregon coast, and as real estate professionals, we love to help with that process. So if that's you, give us a call, send us a text, shoot us an email, or click the link down below in the description of the video and schedule a Zoom call with us. Either way, we would love to help with your move to the Oregon coast. All right, so if you've watched our videos, you probably know that the Oregon coast is 363 miles of coastline. That is a ton of area and a ton of different options for people who are considering moving to the Oregon coast. And beyond just the sheer size of the coastline itself, there are three distinct regions, and within those regions, dozens of little towns, bigger towns, medium-sized towns that present a lot of different options. So for a lot of people, first and foremost, it comes down to identifying what your motivation is. Are you going to be buying a second home? Are you going to be buying a vacation home? Is this an investment property, a vacation rental that you want to rent out? Or is this going to be a home that you are using as your primary residence and you're truly relocating to the Oregon coast full time? We've worked with people across all of those scenarios, and I think with each of those scenarios, there's going to be a little bit of a different process potentially, or at least for sure different considerations that you should be looking at in your home search and identifying a timeline and putting together a game plan for you. And ultimately, that's what we're here to help with. Most people that we've worked with do come to us with an idea in mind. Maybe there's a couple of places that they visited and they really enjoyed. Maybe there are some places where they lived in the past or areas that they have traveled to a lot, and they tend to gravitate toward those areas that are more familiar, areas where they kind of have the lay of the land and that seem to check some of the boxes. Well, when you look at the Oregon coast, there are several towns that really offer a lot of the same benefits as far as these benefits or aspects of living on the Oregon coast that tend to attract people. So for example, there's about a half a dozen larger towns that really have a lot of amenities as far as what a bigger town may offer, like Astoria, Lincoln City, Newport, Florence, Coos Bay, and Brookings. And there's a lot of towns that are maybe just a few thousand people when you look at like Seaside or Tillamook, for example. And then going down the line, there are 10, 20, maybe a couple dozen smaller towns, much smaller towns that maybe have a few hundred people, maybe just over 1,000 people. When you're looking at like Cannon Beach and Manzanita up north, into like Ayahats on the central Oregon coast, Waldport, for example, down to like Port Orford and Gold Beach. So you can really get it all. But I think what a lot of people may not necessarily realize when they're looking for towns on the Oregon coast is that all of these are going to be small towns. So it certainly has to be a prerequisite that you want to be relocating to and living in a small town if you are relocating full time. And that's not something that's going to provide too much of a culture shock, for example, because we've worked with a ton of people from Southern California, Denver, major metro areas around the country, and obviously moving to an area that is more secluded, has a smaller town, there's going to be much different dynamics. And a lot of people ultimately are concerned about, okay, are there going to be these amenities that we're going to need for our day-to-day life? You know, people are looking out, am I going to be able to get groceries? Are there going to be different options for groceries? You know, how's the healthcare? You know, how are the medical services, medical offices? Is there going to be a hospital nearby where I live? Well, I think that despite being, an area which is comprised of much smaller towns than, again, maybe some people necessarily realize, a lot of these towns, in particular, some of the larger towns, do offer options for groceries, great medical services, things to do, of course. And of course, anywhere on the Oregon coast that you live, you're going to have access to the beach, you're going to have access to all this natural beauty, which is probably the biggest thing that tends to draw people in. When people do have the idea of relocating to the Oregon coast, generally what we do is have a conversation with people right out of the gate, typically over a Zoom call. That allows us to really connect a little bit better and have a conversation about your circumstance, and talk about what areas seem to have come up on your radar, what areas are similar that maybe haven't come up on the radar, and then start putting together a home search and a game plan to look at areas that could provide the best fit when we're looking at budget, when we're looking at, again, just the type of lifestyle and amenities that somebody may need. And from there, I think really the best thing that somebody can do, and what we typically recommend people to do, is to make a trip out here. And whether that is looking at a couple of different towns, or like a ton of people have done, and this is probably the best thing to do if you can swing it, is start all the way north or start all the way south and drive the entire coastline. At least spend even 30 minutes, driving around, looking at the shops, the restaurants. Okay, does this look like a place where we could see ourselves living? Or does this look like a place that would be a good area to have a second home or vacation home? Or even as, from the investment perspective, is this an area that people are coming to on vacation and that we would be able to operate a successful income property or vacation rental property? So there's so many dynamics that people can be looking at. That's really where we come in, is helping kind of guide this process and narrowing things down, because from the outset, unless somebody is dead set on one town or a couple of different towns and not going to consider other towns, maybe they really want to be up north close to Portland, for example, they don't want to consider anything further south. Unless somebody is already really narrowed down, there's so many options, right? So let's talk about it. Let's get into talking about, in particular, these three distinct regions on the Oregon coast, which I think provide a good breakout for people, where if you can eliminate a region of the Oregon coast from the outset, that's going to start narrowing things down quite a bit for you. It does become a little bit more difficult, or can be a little bit more convoluted, if people are looking at this where they really like, say, Seaside on the northern Oregon coast, but they really love Coos Bay. I mean, these are areas that are going to be a 4 or 5 hour drive apart when you're driving on 101 at least, because you have to drive through all the towns and everything. So these are areas where if you're looking in one, it's going to be potentially harder to look in the other if you are in those areas, or if you're making a trip out and really, having to bounce back and forth. So when we look at these three distinct regions, there are definitely different pros and cons and things that these areas offer for people. And I think the considerations, when you start digging into this a little bit more, does help narrow things down for people, where they can say, yes, I want to focus on this or that or the other. So first and foremost, when we look at the northern region of the Oregon coast, we're looking at Astoria down to Pacific City, or really a town called Nesquin. Nesquin's just a little village with maybe a couple hundred people that live there, one store, one restaurant. But this stretch of the Oregon coast, the northern Oregon coast, really the biggest thing I think that underscores a lot of the conversation here is that you're in the closest proximity to Portland and to the rest of Western Oregon and the Willamette Valley, where the majority of the population of Oregon lives. So you're going to be getting a lot of people visiting on vacation, or a lot of people even visiting for the day. This is an area that's close enough, again, to the largest population centers in Oregon for people just to make a day trip. So you're looking at increased traffic, car traffic, foot traffic. You're looking at ebbs and flows of different times of year where it's really busy and really bustling, and then you're looking at times of year where it's probably a little more dead. But on the northern Oregon coast in particular, really even in the fall and winter, the weather does tend to be pretty mild, and unless there's a storm or there's torrential downpour, which you don't get that much of, honestly, or if the weather's just miserable overall, you are going to get people coming out this time of year, unless the conditions would suggest otherwise. But even storm watching, you know, is a big tourist attraction at the Oregon coast. So I think people do like to visit the Oregon coast when it's dark and stormy and cloudy and windy. People, I think, kind of like that moody element of the Oregon coast. That in and of itself actually does bring people in. But again, when we look at that northern Oregon coast, probably the biggest thing, your proximity to Portland and the amount of people that are going to be visiting. Although the central Oregon coast too does get a ton of tourism, and we'll talk about that. I think you get the most diversity probably on the northern Oregon coast. You have a larger quantity of towns that are a little bit closer together, especially when you look at this stretch from Astoria down to Gearhart and Seaside, down to Cannon Beach, down to through Arch Cape into Manzanita, and then even down around the Nehalem Bay and Tillamook Bay, all the way down into Tillamook. Really the stretch from Astoria to Tillamook, you're hitting towns very consistently. But again, you do get a ton of diversity. So Astoria, a lot of history here. This is an area where Lewis and Clark ended their expedition and stayed the winter. And so, you know, this is an area where you have a lot of national historic sites. There's a lot of things to do in that regard. Astoria is very unique. It has kind of a bigger city feel in a way, although it's only a few blocks. The downtown area itself, you could tell that this was an area that was kind of destined to, you know, to boom, although it didn't. And we can talk more about the history of Astoria, you know, at some point in the future. But, you know, from Astoria down to Seaside and Gearhart, which are connected, very touristy area. Gearhart full of like second homes primarily, into Seaside, which is like your very quintessential, you know, seaside town, ocean or beachfront town, you know, with shops and candy stores and arcades and things like that, ton of restaurants. It's probably the top place for day trips on the Oregon coast, I would think. People just driving out for the afternoon, coming back, or doing a quick trip for the weekend. But you know, just going down the line on the northern Oregon coast, Cannon Beach, Manzanita, very similar, a little more of an upscale feel. Down into the towns around Nehalem Bay and Tillamook Bay, you're going to get a lot of diversity, and then down into Tillamook, and then again down into Pacific City and Nesquin, you'll get some consistency for sure, but each town really has kind of its own flavor and its own makeup. And I think the northern region overall, you probably get the most influence from Portland too, again, because of the proximity. So you have a high quantity of, you know, very artsy, kind of eclectic towns. You definitely get a higher quantity of more expensive towns too. So especially when you look at like Cannon Beach and Manzanita and Arch Cape, and some of the areas out from Tillamook, like Oceanside and Netarts. I mean, these are some areas that have some of the most expensive real estate on the Oregon coast. And again, I think a lot of that is the draw from Portland and the influence from Portland because of the proximity. On the northern region, you're going to get a ton of great state parks and state rec areas, and a lot of great hiking. Again, you know, you'll get a lot of diversity, not just with the towns, but with the landscape too. So every town kind of has its own unique makeup as far as the landscape, as far as how it's laid out and everything. One thing that definitely comes to mind when you look at the northern Oregon coast is so much of this area, so much of the populated area on the northern Oregon coast is in the tsunami hazard area. So a lot of these towns are at relatively low elevation. And so there's not a lot of areas on the northern Oregon coast where you can get a ton of elevation. I mean, there are areas like in Rockaway, for example, comes to mind, you know, up on the hill above town. There are some houses. These are nice, big, you know, multi-million-dollar homes, or at least million-dollar homes. Astoria is on a hill, so Astoria itself, but you're not even on the ocean in Astoria. You're actually on the Columbia River. So, you know, Astoria is going to be a little bit different overall anyway, but moving down the line from Astoria south down all the way to Pacific City and Nesquin, I mean, these are true beachfront towns by and large. You do have some bayfront as well, like Tillamook, like Garibaldi, like Bay City, Nehalem. These areas are on the bay, and some have a little bit more elevation than others, but again, a lot of the northern Oregon coast is at a lower elevation. And so for some context here, if you're driving from Astoria on the northern Oregon coast down to Nesquin, it's going to be about 2 hours and 15 minutes to make that drive. So anywhere kind of in between, you know, if you really like one area but also like another area, you can get between these towns relatively quickly. So you can cover the span of the northern Oregon coast. If you lived in one town, you can still get out and explore other regions. And I think that's going to be the case you'll find with the central and southern region as well. And so with the central region, you're actually looking at the smallest stretch, so the smallest region on the Oregon coast, with the southern being the largest as far as, you know, the amount of miles that you would have to cover from top to bottom. The central Oregon coast is going to offer you, I think, the most consistency. There's not as many towns on the central Oregon coast as there are on the northern Oregon coast. And the central Oregon coast starts at Lincoln City to the north, which is a very popular area, still only a couple hours, maybe 2.5 hours at most from the Portland metro area. So, you know, very accessible still to, you know, the largest population centers in Oregon. And then down south of Lincoln City, you get into Depot Bay. South of Depot Bay, you get into Newport. And then just south of there, you get into Walport. About 8 miles south of Walport, you get into Yachats. And then you have to drive about 45 minutes or so to get to Florence on the southern end of the central Oregon coast. So this stretch from Lincoln City down to Yachats, you get, again, a ton of consistency. You have Lincoln City and Newport are, you know, 10,000 plus people. Depot Bay, Walport, and Yachats are much smaller, but you really have these 5 core towns throughout this corridor where all of these towns are very accessible to one another. So if you like the central region of the Oregon coast, maybe you really love Newport. Well, if you ended up in Lincoln City, or if you ended up in a Waldport, or even down in Yachats, you're still going to be able to access these areas very easily. And I think that's something a lot of people do like about the central Oregon coast. And so again, this corridor from Lincoln City down to Yachats, you probably have the longest uninterrupted stretches of oceanfront. So as far as your drive, you're really just kind of driving straight a lot of the way through this stretch. Some elevation changes here and there. And then again, you have Florence to the south where you go up and over Cape Perpetua and Heceta Head. So really beautiful, really scenic drive, takes you up away from the ocean, up over these headlands, but it's kind of a slow drive too. So it's still probably about 45 minutes, maybe an hour, but you're driving around a lot of windy curves and stuff like that. So it really creates a clear separation of Florence to the rest of the central Oregon coast. You probably have some of the largest beaches on the central Oregon coast too, in particular around Lincoln City, but you also have some very rocky shoreline too. Once you get into Waldport, then you get down into Yachats. You have a lot of very rocky areas with not as many beaches, although there are some great beaches through this stretch as well. You just have to drive out of town a little bit to get to them, especially if you were living in like a Yachats or a Waldport. Homes are going to be a little bit more affordable on the central Oregon coast when compared to the northern Oregon coast as well, although you can find some pretty affordable towns on the northern Oregon coast as well. But when you look at like Lincoln City and Newport and Depot Bay and Waldport, you do get a lot more affordability as far as what you can get for your dollar. Yachats does tend to skew a little more toward some of the more expensive real estate on the Oregon coast, but I mean, Yachats really has kind of a special feel to it, just as far as the makeup of the town. You have development that is just west of the highway. It's very close to the water, so you're probably going to be a couple blocks from the water at worst, you know, maybe 3, 4, 5 blocks at most up to the highway. And then you have a lot of development up the hill, so there's some very dramatic elevation change up above town where, you know, all of these homes have oceanfront, or rather just ocean views, water views, which is very desirable, in high demand, and definitely adds to the value of real estate for sure. When you look at the Oregon coast as a whole. So this central region, I think overall too, has a little bit more of a local feel, again, despite the proximity from to and from Portland, with the exception of Newport. And Newport, you have the Aquinnah Bayfront, where you have a very touristy area, and Nye Beach as well. Where, you know, these are areas that bring in a ton of people from around the state, from around the region, around the country, and really actually from around the world. Newport definitely has more of a tourist feel kind of in its core area. Lincoln City, I get a lot of second homes, vacation homes, things like that as well, but does have a little more of a local feel. Even in Depot Bay and Waldport and Yachats too, to some degree, a lot of these areas feel a little more unspoiled from the tourism aspect of the Oregon coast. It feels like there's a little more authenticity in some of these areas when you compare it to towns like Cannon Beach and Seaside, for example. And so the Central Oregon coast definitely is an area that a lot of people flock to, that really seems to check a lot of boxes for people when they're relocating to the area. In particular, there's 2 major hospitals, so there's a lot of medical services with 2 large towns in Newport and Lincoln City, ton of grocery stores, shopping. You got the outlet malls in Lincoln City, so you know, really everything that you would need is there. Even if you were living in a smaller town, you can still get to these towns pretty quickly. And then the Southern Oregon coast, also very diverse. Again, I would say that the Northern Oregon coast probably offers the most diversity because there are a lot of different towns, sizes, different makeups of towns, etc. But when you look at the Southern Oregon coast, I would say this is probably the most scenic area of the Oregon coast. It's definitely the most removed and the most secluded when you look at the accessibility, but also when you look at the proximity to the larger population centers in Oregon. If you're in Eugene, you could get to like the Coos Bay area in about an hour and a half, maybe a couple of hours. So you can still get to the northern section of this southern region pretty quickly, and Eugene is one of the larger towns in Oregon. But as you go south, there's not nearly as many highways that go west from I-5, from, you know, this I-5 corridor, again, where most people live in Oregon. So the Southern Oregon coast becomes much less accessible, and just because of that, much more secluded. Also too, because there are less towns. The towns that are on the Southern Oregon coast are much more spread out, with the exception probably of this northern region, where if you go south of Florence on the southern part of that central section, you get into Reedsport, and then you get into North Bend into Coos Bay. That corridor from Florence to Coos Bay is where all the sand dunes are. So you're going to see a lot of like ATVs and dune buggies, and there's also a lot of coastal lakes in this region as well, which is something you can't get in some other areas. So that corridor through there, from, you know, the southern part of the central section to the northern part of the southern section, that corridor through there does tend to attract a lot of people that are more into some of the more extreme outdoor activities, or even just like boating. But the sand dunes allow for a lot more to do than just kind of the run-of-the-mill hiking and beachcombing and things like that you can get in a lot of other areas on the Oregon coast. But when we look at the southern section of the Oregon coast, I think what attracts people most is the seclusion. You know, you're not getting nearly as many tourists, nearly as, you know, much car traffic and foot traffic in these different towns. But also the weather does tend to skew a little bit warmer. You do get more sunny days. You do get more warmer days, hotter days. You know, you could get up into the 80s and over 80s, even into the 90s sometimes when you look at down by Gold Beach and Brookings. It's not going to be probably that much different necessarily when you look at the southern and northern region, because you are going to get a ton of gray, cloudy, foggy days with overcast and rain. I mean, that's just the type of weather that we get here, but you do get a little bit warmer. Very mild weather on the Southern Oregon coast, and again, you get more days of sunshine as well. But I think different things attract different people to different regions of the Southern Oregon coast, or different towns specifically on the Southern Oregon coast. So you have Reedsport down into Lakeside, down into Coos Bay, this Coos County area, where actually I think Reedsport is in Douglas County, but Coos Bay, North Bend into Bandon, that's going to be Coos County, the most populated area on the Oregon coast. And so this just has a much bigger feel as far as a bigger town. When you look at North Bend and Coos Bay, going to be over 25,000 people. Once you get down into Bandon, Bandon is probably the one town on the Southern Oregon coast that feels like a true beach town, a little bit more of a touristy area, a little bit more of a tourist town, where you have saltwater taffy and a bunch of fish and chips and the shops in the cute little downtown area. Bandon, I think, feels a little bit more like some of the towns that you can find on the Northern Oregon coast to some degree, as far as what it offers and the size overall. But Coos Bay itself, there's a little bit more of a local economy there, so people do move there for work. I don't see a ton of people there necessarily moving there for retirement. I think a lot of people that do skew a little bit younger, or people that have kids that want an area that has just more going on, more people overall, do tend to flock toward Coos Bay a little bit compared to other areas of the southern Oregon coast. Into Bandon, I think Bandon, a lot of people want to be in an area that has more of a beach town type feel. There's also world-class golf. Bandon Dunes Golf Course is one of the top rated courses in the world. Well, I think there's 5 or 6 courses there, and maybe 2 or 3 of them are top rated in the world. But either way, I mean, this is an area that brings in a ton of people for golf. And then you start moving south on the Oregon coast. You get into Port Orford, which is a small little town, really beautiful. I would say it probably has more of a local type feel than a tourist type feel. And then you get down into Gold Beach, and then you get into Brookings. Gold Beach feels a little bit more like a second home, a little bit of a resort style type feel with some of the development that you have in the area, some of the beachfront development in particular. It's a smaller town. I think there can't be more than maybe 1,500 people there, maybe a couple thousand people. And then down into Brookings, which is just about 20 minutes, 30 minutes south of Gold Beach. Now, Brookings is a town with about 10,000 people between Brookings and Harbor, and you're right on the California border. I think in Brookings you have a unique dynamic where a lot of people do relocate there. A lot of people do move there from like California, for example, whether they're coming from Northern California, Southern California. It does make sense because you are bordering California and you do have a little bit better weather. So I think and I know actually a lot of people that we talk to that are coming from warmer climates that have more sunshine do express a little bit of concern about moving to the Oregon coast as far as if they can deal with the weather. So I think when people start researching Brookings, they start piecing together that, okay, this could be an area where there could be a little bit of a compromise. But overall, the southern Oregon coast, again, the seclusion in particular really does draw a lot of people, I think. I think people are looking for areas that are more laid back. They don't want to deal with a lot of the tourism, that you can get on the northern and central Oregon coast. Of course, you get tourism on the southern Oregon coast as well. It's just more spread out, and it's probably not as high of a volume. I think that when you look at the southern Oregon coast, a ton of the tourism there, at least in part, is going to be just the sightseeing, because the southern Oregon coast is definitely the most scenic. It's definitely the most underdeveloped, so it's definitely the most kind of unspoiled and untouched stretch or region of the Oregon coast, especially when you look at like Samuel H. Boardman State Park, which is I think about a 7-mile stretch from north to south, and has some of the most photographed areas on the Oregon coast. And so really just driving up and down the southern Oregon coast, you can see it, you can feel it, much more epic landscape. You do have nice beaches, for sure, and there are a ton of areas where you can get out and go hiking, but just the sightseeing overall, the rock formations and things like that just set out into the ocean, definitely is a big draw to the area. And so again, when you look at the Oregon coast from the northern to the central to the southern regions, each area has its own unique offering. I think there's a ton of similarity that you can get in terms of size of towns, amenities, getting everything you need, internet access, for example, that's something that a lot of people ask us about. The beauty, the scenery, you can get that anywhere, but there's going to be different nuances, subtle differences and sometimes major differences in some of these areas. And so again, if you're considering moving to the Oregon coast and you're really looking at how to narrow things down, well, the best thing to do is to just have a conversation with us, and we can talk about what areas are going to suit you best, which I think we can typically glean pretty quickly from a conversation. And so whether you're feeling stuck in maybe starting this process, or you just want to get more clarity, more guidance, give us a call, send us a text, shoot us an email, or click that link down below in the description of the video. Schedule a Zoom call with us. We can have this conversation and talk about your budget and your timeline, your wants, your needs, and put together a game plan for you so when you are ready to start looking, we can hit the ground running. If this video is helpful, make sure to hit the like button. That helps us out a lot. And as always, we appreciate you watching. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.